Leadership's a funny thing because it's certainly a word we hear enough of in the workplace. And as you've heard on the podcast already, I'm always bothered that we never seem to define the damn word. But in this episode, we get deeper. We get into the layers of leadership and how it certainly changed over time, including through the pandemic, and how leaders were actually shown for who they really are, good and bad. Hold on, my guest today, Hamza Khan, is going to grow your brain a little bit. This is Relationships at Work, the employee experience and workplace culture podcast. I'm Russel, always happy to have you join me. Not so happy right now. I had a piece of chocolate just a few moments before I went and put a microphone in front of my face. So now I have this little piece of, I don't know, chocolate or a nut or something in the back of my throat. So I'm trying to push through, but I'm classy, damn it. I'll do it. I'll do it. You know what? I haven't started every podcast like this. There's been a little smoother of an introduction, and you can go back. This is episode like 50 something. We're in the middle 50s. So this podcast has been going for a while, since the beginning of 2022. And I encourage you to go back and maybe look at some of the earlier episodes because they're all evergreen. They are good and timeless, no matter when you want to listen to them. Back talking about handling stress at work, employee motivation, busting silos, compensation, accessibility, DEI, activism, neurodivergency. There is some amazing guests that I've had the absolute pleasure to have a conversation with on this podcast. And I encourage you to go back and maybe check it out. If you've only listened to the last couple episodes because you just discovered this podcast, there is a plethora of shows that'll make your brain a little bit bigger. So please, I encourage you to go back and check it out and listen to some of the earlier shows because you don't want to miss out. I'm just saying. Something that we do seem to miss out, and I talked about on the top, is that we miss out on conversations about leadership. So I invited our guest on through an introduction, actually through a previous guest, Mike Vardy, productivity expert that he is. He had Hamza Khan on his podcast and thought he'd be an amazing addition to our show. So Hamza was gracious enough to come on. He is a instructor over at the Toronto Metropolitan University. And his focus is very much on management should die and leadership should be better. It should be more human. And he gets into the history. He gets into tons of acronyms and different styles of leadership. And it gets deep. And I encourage you to learn as much as I did on this episode. So let's go over to Hamza. And on the show today, we have Hamza Khan. And here is why he is awesome. He's the best-selling author of The Burnout Gamble and his latest book, Leadership Reinvented. He's a two-time TEDx talker. His 2015 talk is now at 2.1 million views. Oof. Lecturer at Ryerson School of Media, podcast host of Ideas into Action, co-founder of Skills Camp, which is a leading soft skills training company, and has worked with such clients as RBC, Microsoft, PepsiCo, LinkedIn. It's a long list of clients and more. He's helping them with their future of work. And he's here today to talk about Leadership Reinvented. Hello, Hamza.
Russell, wow, that was easily top 3 introductions I've ever received in my life. Thank you.
I'm competitive. I got to work for 2 or 1. I got to see what I can do if I can get to those top spots. Thank you for that.
The number 1 was WWE-esque. I can't remember what event it was. I just remember walking out and thinking, why are there no pyrotechnics here?
I can't touch a Ric Flair or a over-the-top kind of introduction that way, but I'm in good company if WWE is my competition. So
that was great. Earlier in my career, I cut my teeth, I suppose, between the University of Toronto Scarborough, Ryerson University, now known as Toronto Metropolitan U, and Seneca College, where you and I have a very interesting connection. Russell, you were one of the founders of the graduate social media certificate program at Seneca College, of which I was one of the earliest instructors.
Fun facts. Yeah, I was on the program advisory council to start that off. Yeah.
Thank you for doing that. That was absolutely instrumental in my career and my development as not just a professional, but as a human being as well. So I'm eternally grateful to you, sir. I am here because of the work that you've done.
Damn. Well, let the blushing commence. Thanks for that. before I get into all this reinvention of leadership in the workplace, because we are about the employee experience and workplace culture, something jumped out at me when I was looking you up a little bit, which is around the Skills Camp program. And you have some interesting phrasing because there is such a push and a pull against the phrase soft skills.
Yes.
Which immediately you'll see people go, no, human skills. Soft makes them diminish. Soft makes them the opposite of hard, which isn't what this is. Why are you still using, or why do you use language like soft skills?
Excellent question, man. I'll let you into a typical day at the Parnell Khan household, where both my partner and I are English students and communication culture students. So we're always overanalyzing, I would say, words and discovering etymologies that were unknown to us. And we get a little frustrated with the term soft skills. We feel like it's something that we have to use to appease or make sense to decision makers in the current zeitgeist. However, we are noticing the change. It's something that we started 7 years ago, I believe, 6 or 7 years ago. And now it's so awesome to see the HR profession, to see the C-suite, and especially the next generation clue into the idea that these are not soft skills. And to your point, that soft implies some sort of hierarchy, and that would be lesser in the hierarchy for whatever reason, culturally ordained. But what we're calling it internally are hot skills, essential skills, human skills, critical skills. And I cannot wait for the day when we can just drop soft skills altogether and call them whatever makes sense in the zeitgeist. And I hope that essential skills sticks, because we're living through an interesting time, and you do work at the heart of digital disruption. And I'm sure you're familiar with, what's happening in the world of AI and how that's going to change the future of work. ChatGPT is something that I'm paying close attention to. And, I feel like by no later than 2045, and McKinsey reckons it's going to happen a lot sooner, by 2027, that everything that can be disrupted, anything that can be automated, will be automated. So the work that's going to be left to do in this post-technological disruption world will be profoundly human. It'll require those essential skills. It'll require us to operationalize and maximize the very things that make us human.
Interesting title. You call it Leadership Reinvented. So by saying that, we're implying that, I'm getting into, the words, it implies that leadership needed to be fixed to begin with. So why does leadership need to be reinvented?
Oh, man. I am tempted to just go all the way down the rabbit hole here and tell you about my third book that's coming out. I'm making it's going to come out next year or the year after. I'm taking my own sweet time working on this because of the depth of information that I have to ingest and make sense of. But the reinvention is interesting because leadership has gone through multiple iterations. And I would say in the last 150 to 200 years, it's seen 3 distinct iterations. It's gone from this command and control, top-down, authoritarian theory X style of management. And I'm sure, Russell, you and I, earlier in our careers, we experienced that style of management. Hell, there's still some remnants of it in our respective organizations right now. And I understand why, because a lot of it is sunk cost fallacy. It's a lot of fear of change, and it's working for some people, but it's not working for most people. And then from theory X, we went into theory Y, which assumed the opposite. It assumed the best in employees, laissez-faire style of management, hands off, empower the employee, but it didn't go far enough. And so the reinvention is calling for a complete flipping of the organization's purpose. An organization's purpose used to be, at least in the corporate sector, to generate a profit, and everything was beholden to the profit. And I think that the relentless pursuit of the profit has revealed something that I think is now manifesting into, I don't think it's conjecture, but I feel like we're in late stage capitalism. I think that the world that we live in has all of the hallmarks of late stage capitalism, a failing system. And I think that's because we've allowed the system to persist for as long as it has, where there's been a small group of people that have been running organizations to maximize individual utility while accepting, neglecting, or provoking the disutility of most. And so leadership reinvention is calling for these very leaders to change their internal compass and to now focus on improving circumstances for employees, for customers, communities, and the planet. And I want to give them the confidence that doing so, putting people first, is actually good for the business. that there is no dichotomy of leadership when it comes to prioritizing the mission and prioritizing people. That if you prioritize people, you will naturally prioritize the mission and you will naturally produce a profitable or a successful nonprofit, corporation, or government agency.
We constantly use phrases like the future of work. It's almost buzzwordy to this point. It almost turns into a drinking game like innovation.
No one knows what it means. I don't even know
but
what it
when
means.
we talk about the future of work, especially when it comes to leadership, we talk about, and you were talking about this in your 2015 TED Talk about it, that here's what leadership is going to be. Here's the future of leadership. But we're all talking about things that employees have wanted forever.
Man.
So the future of work seems to be always, no, we want it now and have been telling you we want this now forever. So it feels like we're living in a future that just never seems to be realized. Am I wrong?
Man, I'm getting fired up, man. You're making me want to pull out my current reading right now. Let me just pull this over here. I'm reading this book, called Death in the Haymarket. And the title is Death in the Haymarket, A Story of Chicago, the First Labor Movement, and the Bombing That Divided Gilded Age America. So for the listeners, Labor Day is honoring the Haymarket Affair of 1886. And check this out. There were protests happening all over Chicago and across the United States and even in different parts of the world to reduce the working hours of the typical workday from 16 to 14 to 12 to 8 hours a day. So something that we take for granted in 2023, that we have 8-hour workdays, came after a long period of revolt and then eventually bloody strife. And so history is peppered, I would even say littered, with examples of creators, of laborers, of people who are doing the work, trying to advocate for a more humane way of working. They're trying to advocate for better healthcare, benefits, meaningful work, less monotonous work, greater job security, you name it. But the concessions have not been made. And through this research, which initially began as me search, because I was like, hey, man, I've been a bad leader. I've been a good leader. I don't understand what my motivations were when I was behaving at cross purposes with my organization. I was trying to maximize profitability. I was trying to maximize individual utility, but I also had good intentions, but I was neglecting my staff. And I can go into some stories about that later. Why was that happening? I was trying to find a boogeyman. Why are people behaving this way? I mean, is the reason why Walmart eventually, as of yesterday, so we're recording this in late January, just yesterday, they decided in the United States to raise the minimum wage for its employees to $15. It's like, whoa, that's like a decade too late, if you ask me. Why is this happening? And the answer isn't simple. It's not evil. It's not like some fat cat sitting at the top of their organizations with their legs on their desks, puffing cigars, just being like, how do we screw over the employees? I mean, yes, there are examples of that happening. And the media tends to sensationalize them. But for the most part, it's leaders operating from a place of fear. They're stuck in these fear cycles of competition, prediction, control, separation. They're trying to maximize parts. They're maximizing individual benefit. And what happens is they just get caught up in these cycles of active inertia where they think they're doing the right thing by competing along the lines of the marketing mix, place, product, place, whatever the marketing mix that we learned is. And we're starting to see now finally that organizations and leaders that are prioritizing anything other than the welfare and the thriving, I would say, of their people are experiencing turbulence and will eventually tumble into the chasm of time. I'm absolutely certain of this.
2015, 28-year-old Hamza comes out on a TEDx stage and does a TED Talk about how management doesn't have a role in the future, but leadership sure as shit does.
Yeah.
You scared the crap out of a lot of people. From what
I scared the crap out of myself, man.
But having said that, I mean, I use air quotes of visionary, even though it kind of felt like that. It's like, oh my God, he's providing concept, providing direction and vision and trusting your staff. What a novel concept.
Yeah. But
from 2015 to 2023, what's changed? I mean, the pandemic seemed to accelerate everything. I love I think there's a political cartoon where they're like, so what was the factor of change for your organization the most? Your CEO? Nope. Your change agents? Nope. A pandemic? Yep. Like
Yep.
it was really people that had nothing to do with it. They were forced to do it.
100%.
But again, there's been a lot of change. So what have you seen from 28-year-old Hamza to now?
Wow. Good math, by the way. I didn't realize I was 28 when I delivered that talk.
Oh, you're adorable.
It just, again, it's BC. It's before coronavirus. I don't remember much. This could be the long COVID that I'm still dealing with. Man, that talk was fascinating because I did it from, wow, I have a hard time watching that talk. I think I've watched it like twice. The second time I watched it, I was like, this isn't as bad as I thought it would be because I'm such a novice speaker. I can see my body language. It's so closed. But the idea was so pure. The idea was that the way we've been managed is inconsistent with the behaviors and expectations of the generation I was a part of back then. I guess I still am, millennial. And it's certainly true for the next generation, Gen Z, and it will continue to be true. Revolutions never go backwards. And so there's no way that future generations are going to put up with a tyrannical, autocratic style of leadership that prioritizes the needs of the owner, the operator, the CEO, and the organization while behaving in an anti-subordinate way. So I did that talk, and man, I've never really told the story in full. I've alluded to it. I've added bits and pieces in the opening of Leadership Reinvented, and I think I might have said this on a couple of other podcasts, but the day after I did that TED Talk, I got called into my boss's office. Like that same night, I got an email being like, tomorrow morning, first thing in the morning, I need you in the office. And I got dressed down. I swear to God, I got dressed down for doing that TED Talk. Why didn't you tell me? Why are you putting these ideas out there? These are seditious ideas. They're going to undermine the established order here at the university. Now I have to account and I have to explain to my colleagues why we're running some rogue shop over here. But I'm like, it's not really a rogue shop. We're winning awards. We're clearly the talk of the university. Our blueprints are being replicated, not just across the country, but around the world. Students are happy. Staff are happy. Like, what are we doing wrong here? And I think the wrong thing that we were doing was just upending the existing order, the established order. And could I have been more delicate in the way I went about presenting this idea and gotten buy-in for that? Yeah, I could have, but I think throughout the process, they would have neutered the language of the talk, and I would have had to remove the things that made it as effective as it did. So I did that talk. It got rave reviews from people who were bought into that message. And then there was a bit of a lull. And I think that during that lull, I was losing my confidence in the message because I was seeing so many manifestations of bad leadership, destructive leadership, toxic leadership rear its head and, mount some defenses and comebacks over the next couple of years. And then the pandemic happened, like you said. And what became very clear and what was the impetus for me writing Leadership Reinvented was how sudden, unexpected change, adversity, it forced leaders to act in ways that are truly aligned with their leadership potential and disposition. There's this misconception that leaders step up during times of a crisis, but the opposite is actually true. They sink back to the level of their training, values, and preparation. And man, Russell, did we see some leaders fumble. I mean, who people are during a time of a crisis is really who they are. And we got to see clearly the equation change for what employees value in the workplace. We got to see leaders who were operating from a place of fear or were behaving in very selfish ways. They were exposed. And that talk, that TEDx talk, just got a new life at that point. Because people were like, whoa, this is putting into words how I'm feeling right now, where my boss is insisting that I come into the office, even though we're in the middle of a global pandemic, where they're forcing me to do all of this extra labor, to go above and beyond without fair reward and compensation, where they don't have the skills to help me work remotely. And then it got a new wind once we started emerging from the pandemic, and then this conversation of return to the office started to happen. And you had employees say, but we've been not only productive, this organization has been thriving for the last 2 years, and now you want us back in the office? Why? And so I'm just sitting back and I'm watching all of this happen. And the thing that I was hoping would happen with this TEDx talk several years ago, that the conversation would enter the zeitgeist and the consciousness of the workers, so to speak, would elevate so that they would demand better for themselves. I think it's happening. Sorry, I get really fired up about this shit, man. I think it's definitely reading away. Death in the Haymarket. It's stoking my anarchist tendencies, maybe.
I love that you said that, because I'm always been a champion of the idea of mindset over tactics, because we seem to confuse leadership as if you checkbox these 7 things, you're a good leader, which we both know is not a thing.
No,
It's all
sir.
about mindset, because if we go to conferences, we get fired up. These are great ideas. Then you go back to your office and you don't do any of them because
Yep.
you're you. And if
Yep.
you were doing those things, you would have been doing them already. So the idea that COVID really put a spotlight on mindset versus tactics seems to be now bleeding into, like you're saying, return to work, because remote work seems to be that conversation that's still happening, of that yo-yoing of you can, oh no, everybody, no, wait, come back. No, everybody can leave. And we're seeing it from the biggest organizations,
Dude.
still. Do you feel like are we always being tested, or is just this the latest flavor?
I'm curious to see how this is going to play out. And, without naming some of these large organizations, we're quite familiar with one of them that is now insisting on its people coming back. And I'm hearing from the ground level, on the ground, but not just from frontline employees, even from directors and above, that the do this because that's the way it's always been done, or the don't question this is the way it's going to be moving forward, is not producing the intended outcome. The intended outcome is commitment, but no one's committed. People are just compliant at best, but for the most part, they're resisting because, again, for the last 3 years, people have worked effectively from home. And so we've shown, especially in the realm of knowledge work, that collaboration can happen, that the serendipitous conversations can happen if we have the right platforms in place like Slack or MS Teams that allow for that fluid chat, and people are happier. And I said this earlier, like the equation has changed. People are now valuing time with family, time in nature, not being in a cubicle when the sun's out, shortening their commute and not unnecessarily putting themselves in danger with the commute every single day, eating better, so on and so forth. It just seems like a more human way to work. But with that being said, there are some compelling reasons to bring people back into the office. But unfortunately, the leaders are not going about communicating that in a way that is getting the buy-in necessary. And there's so many different ways that you can persuade people to come back into the office, but it has to be a discussion. There has to be a dialogue. It has to be done in consultation with employees. And unfortunately, that's not being done. So this chasm that exists between the employee experience and the leadership experience is becoming more pronounced. It's getting wider and wider. And there's so many stats that can illustrate just how wide this is. For instance, McKinsey put out a report that showed that on average, leaders rate workplace dimensions associated with health and well-being. And so these would be things like, employee benefits and the commute time to work, how supportive and how psychologically safe they feel and those sorts of things. On average, the leaders rate it 22% higher than subordinates. So there's like a different reality almost for leaders. So that's just one of them. And then Edelman found in a survey of, I think, 21,000 people across 34 different markets. It's weird how I remember that, but I don't remember the how old I was when I was doing my TEDx talk. They found that for the most part, frontline workers, Gen Z, parents, and women were surviving or struggling during the pandemic, but meanwhile, leaders were thriving. And this is the sort of thing that chills me to my core, that makes my blood boil right after, because I'm like, man, the answer is right there. And you suggested it earlier, we know what needs to be done, but it's not happening. Why is this will not resulting in the desired outcomes? And that's what I spend all of my days thinking about.
And yet those same leaders will drop the word innovation into every other email, while still, but it's not how I like to work. But it's not how I like to work. These do not line up. And that's leads me to my next question, which is definitions. Now, one of my biggest pet peeves is that we will use words, and I count leadership as a big one. Innovation, diversity. These are words we throw around, but actually never really define for organizations. Leadership being one where you touch in Leadership Reinvented on leadership is about intention. It's about operationalization. There you go. Put a damn word in I can't pronounce. It's ongoing. It's continuous reinvention, yes, and more. That makes leadership sound complicated.
Yeah.
Do you think its leadership is complicated in trying to get it to be understood by others?
Ooh, man, what a good question. Leadership is very simple, but it's difficult. It's not complicated, but it's very difficult because the easy thing to do is to wield power the way it's always been wielded. Is that the right word? Wielded?
It works. Good communication's bad grammar, but go with that.
Damn, yeah, man. I'm dishonoring my alma maters here. So it's easy to just take a one-size-fits-all approach to leading, and that's not really leading. That's managing. That's wielding power. And there's different phases of power. There's coercive power. There is agenda power. There's paradigm power, and we can go into the 4 dimensions of power, but that's not relevant to this. It's not going to produce the desired outcome. So if you're just managing, and you're not supposed to manage people, you're supposed to manage things like budgets, processes, events. But people are meant to be led. But if you are to lead in a way that is in accordance with the light triad of leadership, this is what employees have been demanding for a long time. They want the inverse of the dark triad. And for those not familiar with the dark triad, that's subclinical levels of Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and narcissism. This is essentially how you have, make the rich guy richer, the person who exists at the top of the organization, stamping everybody down below them. The inverse of that is the light triad, and it's composed of the inverse of those traits. So you have Kantianism, which is the belief that people are ends, not means. Then there's humanism. This is belief in the dignity and worth of every human being. And then there's faith in humanity, which is the belief that people are fundamentally good and worth investing in. If you take that approach as a leader and you distill it down to this idea that a leader's job is to create more leaders, and I would take it a step further, a leader's job is to make themselves obsolete. That is difficult for humans to internalize because we have a defense mechanism that wants to protect the resources that we have. And so this idea that giving away power and helping other people to take things away from you, it just seems counterintuitive. And so that results in counterproductive workplace behaviors where the leader withholds information. They create information asymmetry. They become antagonistic towards people that are underperforming. They become punitive, and they try to preserve their little domain over there. But they don't know that what happens as a result of that is the organization becomes closed off. And if an organization becomes closed off to the external environment, that's when the rate of change on the inside of the organization slows down. And if the rate of change on the inside of the organization fails to keep pace with the rate of change on the outside, that's the end. So in sum, the leader's job is very simple. It's to create more leaders. And that's going to require them taking a individualized approach to every single person that reports into them, to learn about them, to care about them, to help them thrive, to remove obstacles from their path, to communicate with them in a way that helps them grow and helps them learn in the organization. And I know even in just saying this, I'm like, that is exhausting, especially if you get to like more than 3 direct reports. And so the easy thing again to do is to become closed off and to become an authoritarian leader or a manager. But then, if you're trying, I think Tolkien said it best, shortcuts now result in roadblocks later. So if you take shortcuts with managing people in the present, it's only going to result in organizational failure down the road. So it's just better to lead, not manage.
You introduced some cool concepts in the book as well, which is the idea that we live in a VUCA world.
Yeah.
VUCA sounds like a swear word, but
it does.
Volatility, uncertainty, complexity. Exactly. VUCA you. Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity
yes, sir.
is the world we've lived in and accelerated since the pandemic. But you have an antidote called S.I.D.E.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's the answer?
It is a answer. It's not the answer. I think that people have their own flavors for essentially the same thing. So for the listeners, VUCA or VUCA, as we're going to call it now, as volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity as undeniable characteristics of our ever-changing world. And then you also have the UK's equivalent of that, which is Bonnie, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. And then PwC introduced a really good one recently that I've been thinking about more and more. It's adapt, asymmetry, disruption, aging systems, polarization, and trust diminishment. And everybody feels this. Everybody sees this. You open up Twitter, you watch the news, you listen to a podcast, like evidence of VUCA, Bonnie, and adapt, they're everywhere. And it feels like the rate of change in the world is accelerating at a breakneck speed, and people are unable to keep up. And so the chaos is causing people to experience different levels of, an amygdala hijack, the fight, flight, and freeze response that many of us felt at the beginning of the pandemic. But to override that, I think the S.I.D.E model, operationalizing and maximizing servitude, innovation, diversity, and empathy, it enables you to anticipate change and then enact the change well before change is required. So instead of resisting chaos, and ADAPT, Bonnie, and VUCA, they're all pointing to the same universal force. It's entropy, the scientific concept that explains how if left unchecked, disorder and randomness tend to increase over time. So if left unchecked, a person's circumstances, a nonprofit, a corporation, a government agency circumstances are not going to improve. It's going to require ingesting and constantly staying abreast of trends happening in the external environment and ensuring that the core of the organization is changing faster than the outside of the organization. And to do that, I propose that those 4 values, servitude, innovation, diversity, and empathy, will unlock people's potential in the organization to, again, anticipate change and react to it well before it happens. But there's other values as well. I've also talked about attunement, resilience, creativity. I've talked about honesty, openness, and transparency. The core idea governing any of these traits, these values, is if they're pro-social or not. That's really it. And this is underscored by a model that called the D factor of personality traits. Russell, have you heard about this?
I haven't, but now I'm all curious.
This is really cool, man. Psychopathy, Machiavellianism, narcissism, sadism, and any sort of aggressive, anti-human, anti-social traits that human beings have or exhibit are all governed by what's known as the D factor of personality. And the D factor of personality is just this. It's the tendency to maximize individual utility at the expense of group utility. So you maximize what's good for you while accepting, neglecting, or provoking disutility for others. And so just as long as you're operationalizing and maximizing a trait or any number of traits that are going to make other people's lives better, that's a surefire way to anticipate and react to change, because you're not disabling somebody. You're not preventing them from sharing information with you. You're not preventing them from gathering information and acting on it in a way that's for the group's benefit.
So how do we get there? What are things you talk about servitude, you talk about innovation,
Sure.
diversity, empathy, all important, as well as resilience, as well as creativity. And I'm seeing leaders that want to make change going, oh my God, where do I start? Do I just do empathy for the next 3 years and get to servitude later? Like, they're looking at it a la carte almost, or because all of it seems like a lot. And it's a lot for a lot of people to take in, especially if you're trying to change the type of leadership that you've been perpetuating.
Yeah.
Where do we get going?
Oh man, I'm glad you asked that, because I'm becoming very self-aware in this podcast, and I'm like, man, I'm just throwing haymakers here. I'm just giving every model, every anecdote possible. I'm just like overloading the audience with information. I'm like, Hamza, you're doing that thing again where you're just getting really fired up and you just want to give everybody everything in your head right now, which I'm happy to do, but I think I have a responsibility as a communicator to distill it. And so I'm glad you asked that question. A acronym that I came up with recently, which I laughed at first because I'm like, oh man, I'm just another speaker with their weird acronym. But this one's really, really funny, man. I asked an audience of grocery store owners how they want to be described by their employees in 2023. And they gave me great words, right? I have some of them over here. Let me just read some of them out to you. They said things like, my boss is inspirational. My boss is positive. My boss is inspiring. My boss is always available. My boss is supportive. My boss is compassionate. And all these things were good. And I said, you know what I want your employees to describe you as? I want them to describe you as hot. And everyone in the room was like, what? And this one lady, she put her hand up. She's like, I don't think HR would be okay with that. I'm like, no, I want you to be hot. No, I want your employees to describe you as hot in a way that is very much aligned with HR's expectations. And I broke hot down into honesty, openness, and transparency. I want these leaders to be described. I want leaders who are listening to this podcast right now to be described by their employees as honest, open, and transparent. And honesty in this case would be synchronizing perceptions of the organization. So I alluded to this chasm that exists between leaders and their subordinates. I think that honesty is going to require everyone in the organization, especially leaders, gaining an accurate understanding of what it's like to be employed at that organization, and creating a psychologically safe space where people can provide candid feedback about their working conditions. Are they happy? Are they well-resourced? Are they experiencing any of the upstream factors that influence burnout? So there's that. Then openness is holding space for others. I can't tell you how many leaders, Russell, I speak to that don't have one-on-ones with their employees. And I'm like, oh my goodness, like I don't know how to tell you guys, but your organization's going to fail. If you keep this up, you're going to tank this organization. How do you not talk to your employees? And they're like, oh, we do annual reports. I'm like, that's not good enough, man. Like the reason why you're seeing levels of burnout and turnover and disengagement in your organization is directly connected to your employees not feeling like they have a partner relationship with you. And then finally is transparency. Make success unquestionably clear. Everybody should know what we're working towards. There needs to be a clear purpose, a clear mission, vision, a set of values, principles, and a purpose, and a way for people to assess if they're contributing to that in a meaningful way. And this is simple. Just have clear objectives and key results. Have clear areas of responsibility, and then structures where you're over communicating what those are. And so, I think that if leaders want to do anything dramatic, but quite simple, but that will produce dramatic results this year and beyond, just keep things hot.
What that brings up for me is that, and you didn't do this, but it does, a lot of minds go to this going, okay, we need to talk to the frontline staff. We need to make them more engaged. We need their leaders to be more hot. And yet we have middle management, which are also leaders, who are also not feeling inspired, motivated, getting an open environment, feeling the transparency. And yet their C-suite will look at them going, make that happen. Make that happen for your staff, when they themselves in the middle are not feeling this. So they don't see modeled behavior. They don't see their own inspiration. They're getting burnt out, but then they're supposed to create this utopia for their own staff. So what is the, and I mean, it's almost a missing middle in another way. So what have you seen around that area?
Wow. And this is very peculiar because I recently read that 70% of leaders, middle managers, especially, are feeling used up by the end of the workday. And that phrase used up correlates very strongly with full-blown occupational burnout. And that another report that I read found that 86% of leaders, which is almost all of them, are 2 to 3 months away from leaving their job to restore their well-being. I mean, this totally is sound the alarms. This is out of control here. So yes, absolutely. Frontline staff are feeling it. Managers are feeling it. And I think it is a direct reflection of the intention, behavior, and purpose or lack thereof of the senior leaders. I'm very, very aggressive when it comes to this. I do believe that there's no such thing as bad employees. There's only bad leaders. And if there are bad employees that have been there for a long time, that is a direct reflection of the leadership and their inability to transition them swiftly out of the organization. So what needs to happen as soon as possible is, the leaders need to sit down and just reinvent their leadership style altogether. Because if they are experiencing resistance and just half-assed compliance in an organization, that's not an employee problem. That is a distinctly leadership problem. And I don't want to mince my words. I don't want to add anything else to that. I'm happy to qualify this. If there's anyone listening to this right now that's like, no, but I have a unique situation, no problem. Reach out to me and we can diagnose this together. But trust me, somebody that lives, sleeps, and breathes this, that is always the answer. It's always leadership. And I'll just give you the model over here. There's the leadership theorists and researchers agree that there's really only 2 paths to leadership. There's the dominance path and there's the prestige path. And the dominance path uses things like coercive power, reward power, and I forget the other one over there, but just basically, carrot and stick, top down, exert control. And it's very forceful. Now, the dominance path can work if everybody is bought into the mission. So for example, if you're in the theater of war, you do want a dominant leader because everybody knows what the mission is and you want somebody screaming at you and yelling at you and helping you to navigate those amygdala hijacks that you're experiencing time and again. If you're a basketball coach, you want to be a dominant basketball coach while the game is being played, because things are happening at a very fast click. I imagine that you just need to force an outcome in those situations, but everybody has to be bought in. For the most part, though, in organizations, corporate, government, nonprofit, the prestige style of leadership is the only one that gets replicated. You can try the dominant style of leadership, but it's not going to be copied because people don't like being tyrannized. They don't like being dominated. Right. There's only two sub paths within the prestige leadership path, and that is referent power, and there's also skill power, expert power. Referent power is behaving in a way that's friendly and encouraging, that's human. And so it's like a soft power, if you will. And again, thinking about that false dichotomy of soft and hard from earlier. And then the other one is expert power, where you have expertise, but you're also sharing it and teaching other people how to develop similar expertise. So right now, and I'll put a button in this. If there's resistance and if there's half-assed compliance in an organization, I think that the senior leaders need to take a hard look at how they're leading the organization. Are they approaching it from a dominance perspective, or a prestige perspective? And there's a fairly good chance that it's they're using dominance where prestige is necessary.
Are you hopeful at all, Hamza? with the idea of, and I mean this as maybe you might be, because with millennials, and I love when I bring up millennials, and I still do this today, and I bring up millennials, and you'll see the older generations roll their eyes. I'm like, they're not children anymore. This is middle management now.
It's us, man.
They're mid-40s. So with millennials coming in and Gen Z, depending which country you're in, which aren't putting up with the same shit that I put up with.
Yeah.
And I'm more jealous of them than I am thinking they're upstarts. So are we hopeful? Are you hopeful that with this new generation coming in and literally looking at these organizations and not putting up with what you call active inertia, are you?
Wow, man, this is last night I just had a depressed moment, if you will. I was just sitting down and I was just comprehending the changes that are happening in the world of work, and I looked to my wife and I'm like, oh man, do you think everything's going to be okay? She's like, yeah, of course, it's clearly working. And I'm like, I don't feel like that sometimes, man. I feel like we're regressing. I feel like we're moving backwards here. But I have to remind myself time and again that revolutions never go backward. And the changes that we're seeing now, even though we're seeing mounted resistance coming from different industries, the finance sector, we're seeing certain leaders in the news getting lauded for turning up the heat at their workplaces, like Mark Zuckerberg being like, we got to turn up the heat, and Elon Musk being like, we're going to have to become really intense. And I'm like, oh man, and they're being celebrated. But I have to remind myself that the reality of employees on the ground, very different, that people are smarter, that the level of consciousness has been raised, and that this conversation that we're having today, Russell, and everybody who's tuning in, you're part of the change. You're now listening to these ideas being exchanged by Russell and I. You're forming your own ideas about your place in your respective organization. You're looking at your boss differently. You're thinking about your leadership style differently. This is perfect. This is fantastic. And I have seen a net change just in the last 10 years that I've been doing this. I mean, the fact that I think it's self-evident that we're still talking about this TEDx talk that was done in 2015, 8 years later. To me, that's a sign that clearly we're moving in the right direction, that enough conversations are happening, enough resistance is being mounted to the old management playbook. It gives me hope. And again, I come back to this book over here, Death in the Haymarket. I hope that this current movement doesn't result in the unnecessarily bloody struggle that happened in 1886, but that it's going to give way to hopefully an honest, open, and transparent conversation between the people who are running organizations right now and the people that are actually doing the work in the organizations. And it'll yield a better way of working. I'm hopeful for utopia, but I will accept a more humane workplace.
I can't think of a better segue into my last question, which is, Hamza, what is one simple action people can do right now to improve relationships at work?
All right, here we go. One simple action, and I'm going to give you both sides of this. If you're an employee, insist on structured and frequent one-on-ones with your boss. And if you are a quote unquote boss, and don't think of yourself as a boss. You're a leader. You're not a manager. You're not a boss. You're a leader. And leaders help other people. Leaders lead from behind. If you're not already having structured and frequent one-on-ones with your employees, with the people who you serve, not the other way around, they don't serve you, you serve them, do that ASAP. And let me go into some specifics here. You should try to have these one-on-ones weekly. And if you can't do weekly, bi-weekly at most. If you're waiting for a month or a quarter or at the end of the year to have your one-on-ones, it's too long. Keep them private. They should be pre-scheduled. They should be fixed, hard-coded in your calendar. They shouldn't move unless there's an absolute emergency. And the structure should be very simple. Divide it into 3. Keep it a 30-minute meeting. For the first 10 minutes, it's your employee's agenda. And you have to give them the psychological safety necessary to use that 10 minutes to disclose anything that's bothering them about maybe you and your working relationship, where they can elevate concerns, where they can bring proposed solutions to you, where they can talk about their family, they can talk about their friends. It's whatever they want to talk about for 10 minutes. Let them express. The middle 10 minutes are then your agenda, what you want to see improved, where you can celebrate some of their accomplishments, where you can give them some candid feedback that will help them to overcome challenges in the future. And then the last 10 minutes should be future focused, because I think a lot of people right now, and they have been feeling this for a long time, but especially right now, are feeling uncertain about their place in the workplace. They feel like they might not have a job. They feel like, you as a boss, I'm speaking to the bosses or the leaders right now, that you have it out for them, that you're looking for ways to fire them. Use those last 10 minutes to assuage their fears and to give them some long-term perspective. Tell them about what your plans are for them for the next 5 to 10 years. In fact, flip it back to them and say, where do you want to be in this organization 5 to 10 years from now? You develop an individual path moving forward. And those structured, those frequent one-on-ones will be an absolute game changer, because this has been proven time and again. Google's Project Oxygen study found that high-performing leaders tend to have more one-on-ones and frequent one-on-ones with their subordinates than leaders who didn't, and that also employees who have partner-like relationships during their one-on-ones with their leaders tend to report greater life satisfaction than those who don't. And that phrase right there, greater life satisfaction, man, I get chills when I talk about it, because we're not talking about the future of work. Throughout this podcast, we've been talking really about the future of life itself.
That's Hamza Khan. He's an academic, keynote speaker, and best-selling author. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
Sir, thank you. This was absolutely wonderful. Thank you. And I'm really grateful to Mike for making this introduction.
And that'll do it for another episode of Relationships at Work, the Employee Experience and Workplace Culture Podcast. This is Russell saying goodbye, and if you liked the episode or any one of these episodes, I encourage you to subscribe, I encourage you to share, I encourage you to leave a rating and review on one of those platforms. Spotify, Apple, you know the usuals. Anyway, if you have a moment, I can't tell you how much it would mean to the podcast and to me to sort of get the word out and build this podcast as we nurture like a fine flower, with ratings and reviews being the water in which I'm going to shut up now. Anyway, really appreciate the help. Take care.